Hey, Dr. Avinash here. This is a session of blood pharmacology. Now, there will be three important videos that I'll be sharing with you related to blood pharmacology. Video number one, this one is going to be about blood clotting. Video number two is going to be about blood formation. So, we'll be talking about iron and vitamins in that video. And video number three would be about oral hypolipidemics, so medicines that lower the lipid levels in somebody's blood. So let's start with the first topic, drugs affecting hemostasis. This video, for the sake of convenience, will be divided into three distinct parts. This is part number one, where I am talking about drugs that act on the coagulation cascade. Now, I presume you already know the fact that coagulation cascade is just a series of reactions involving numerous coagulation factors. The reaction eventually ends or culminates by activation of fibrinogen to fibrin, and fibrin forms the clot. There are two important pathways by which fibrin clot can be made: extrinsic pathway and intrinsic pathway. The extrinsic pathway is activated by tissue factor. Along with factor 7, activated factor 7, clotting factor 10 is activated. Clotting factor 10 then activates prothrombin to thrombin. Thrombin then activates fibrinogen to fibrin, and fibrin forms the necessary clot. Intrinsic coagulation cascade starts with activation of clotting factor 12, that activates clotting factor 11, which activates clotting factor 9, which activates clotting factor 8. Eventually, clotting factor 8 also activates clotting factor 10. 10 then activates prothrombin to thrombin, and thrombin activates fibrinogen to fibrin, and fibrin forms the clot. Now, using this flowchart, it's very easy to understand that if we can somehow increase the level of these clotting factors, then the chances of clotting will increase, right? We'll call them coagulants. These medicines are called as coagulants. Coagulants are medicines that enhance the presence of clotting factors in someone's body. And of course, they will favor clot formation. The other kind of medicines we are going to study is the medicine that decreases the presence of these clotting factors in the blood. We'll call them anticoagulants. Simple. So let's first focus on coagulants. There are two types of coagulants that we know of: vitamin K and miscellaneous. Vitamin K is actually of three types. Vitamin K1 comes from plant source. It is fat soluble and it is also called as phytonadione. Vitamin K2 is the menaquinone, and vitamin K3 is the synthetic form of vitamin K. It is available in two formats: fat soluble menadione, acetomenaphthone, and water soluble menadione sodium bisulfite and menadione sodium diphosphate. Simple. There are miscellaneous coagulants such as human fibrinogen, antihemophilic factor, desmopressin, adrenochrome, monosemicarbazone, rutin is there, ethamsilate is there, but these are not asked in exams and these are less important as compared to vitamin K, and hence my primary focus is going to be on vitamin K. Now, vitamin K is a fat soluble vitamin that we eat in our diet, but more importantly, this vitamin is also generated by the bacteria inside our GIT, inside our large intestine, and as a result the amount of vitamin K we need to eat in our diet is also very less. Only 3 to 10 micrograms per day is sufficient. The actual requirement of an adult is only 50 to 100 picograms per day. So if you eat 3 to 10 micrograms and whatever is created inside the GIT, the 50 to 100 picogram per day is easily taken care of. Simple. We have noticed that for vitamin K1, there is an active transport process located in jejunum. But as far as vitamin K2 and K3 is concerned, they enter into the bloodstream by simple diffusion. What would happen if vitamin K is not there? Well, vitamin K is a coagulant. If it is not there, there will be no clots, and as a result, bleeding will take place. Simple. Bleeding usually manifests as hematuria for the first time. So if the patient is attentive enough, hematuria would be the first sign of vitamin K deficiency that he will notice. How does vitamin K work? Well, for that we need to understand how clotting factors are formed. The clotting factors formed in the liver are clotting factor 2, 7, 9 and 10. Clotting factor 2, 7, 9 and 10, when they are synthesized in the liver, they are in the non-functional prozymogen forms. They are not functional. Okay, they cannot be activated. They are not just inactive, they cannot be activated. I hope you get the difference. We want to convert these non-functional prozymogens into functional zymogens. Functional zymogens would be inactive forms of these enzymes, these proteins, which can be activated. Getting the difference? So non-functional prozymogens cannot be activated. We want to convert them into functional zymogens, which are not working right now but can be activated when the time comes. To convert the non-functional prozymogen into functional zymogens, you require an enzyme called as gamma glutamyl carboxylase, and this enzyme requires vitamin K to function. Which means if a person does not have vitamin K, gamma glutamyl carboxylase will not work, and as a result clotting factor 2, 7, 9 and 10 will remain in the non-functional prozymogen form. In this reaction, vitamin K gets oxidized, and as a result it becomes non-functional itself. But not to worry, we eat vitamin K from outside, the bacteria make vitamin K for us, plus vitamin K, oxidized vitamin K, can be reactivated into reduced vitamin K by an enzyme, vitamin K reductase. More information about this enzyme later on in this particular video. But I hope you have got this. Remember, no vitamin K, no action of gamma glutamyl carboxylase, no functional zymogen, no clot, which means, now this is very important, absence of vitamin K leads to fallen clotting factor, which leads to bleeding. Give vitamin K in all those people who have low vitamin K so that they don't bleed. So where can we use vitamin K? Wherever there is dietary deficiency, right? Or wherever we are expecting the person's intestinal bacteria to not make enough vitamin K. Why would that happen? Simple, antibiotic therapy. If a patient is taking prolonged antimicrobial therapy, chances are his intestinal bacteria will die. If the intestinal bacteria die, they can't make vitamin K for the patient. So you might have to replenish the vitamin K stores of this patient by giving vitamin K tablets. Vitamin K is a fat soluble vitamin, right? Fat soluble vitamins require bile for absorption. If a person is suffering from obstructive jaundice or has some kind of malabsorption syndrome, he will not be able to absorb the natural form of vitamin K, which is fat soluble. And hence, we might recommend water soluble vitamin K or even give vitamin K injections to these people. Logical? Who makes bile? Liver. So in all cases of liver disease, chances of bile production decreases. So there will be deficiency of vitamins, especially fat soluble vitamins. Then you can give vitamin K. And in newborn babies, see, newborn babies do not have gut flora. They are just born. They are completely sterile inside their GIT. It is the mother's bacteria, the bacteria from the hospital, which the baby picks up, and then these bacteria colonize the GIT after the child is born. Which means when the child is born, the child does not have intestinal bacteria. So if there is no intestinal bacteria, there is no vitamin K, and hence when a baby is born, we give injection of vitamin K. We prefer giving K1 or K2, not K3. Vitamin K3 causes severe side effects in babies, so we do not give it. Also, if oral anticoagulants are taken in excess, the oral anticoagulants will decrease the level of clotting factor. You can add vitamin K, it will increase the level of clotting factor, removing the toxicity of oral anticoagulants. Simple. These are 6 important reasons why we give vitamin K. Now for the last one, we prefer K1 because it's the most fastest acting. Easy. Lastly, even when somebody has taken a medicine that decreases platelets or decreases the functioning of the platelets, such as aspirin, salicylate therapy, there also you can try giving vitamin K, it will work fantastic. Simple. The miscellaneous drugs that I have already spoken about, they work more locally. Okay, they are called as local hemostatics or styptics. If a person is bleeding, you don't wait for the medicines. You put a gauze piece, or even if you're in the field, a kerchief, any kind of cloth on the wound, and you press. That manual pressure itself stops bleeding most of the time. But these medicines, local hemostatics, works better on oozing surfaces. The fibrin, gelatin foam, cellulose is available. These, when you put on the oozing surface, they form a meshwork, a network, and they stop the bleeding from happening. Simple. Thrombin, it is applied as a dry powder. It's like directly adding thrombin. So all the fibrinogen in that particular region will get converted into fibrin. So you don't have to wait for the intrinsic or the extrinsic clotting factors to start their work. This can work faster. Even vasoconstrictors will decrease the amount of blood reaching the wound, so automatically bleeding will decrease. And last but not the least, we also have medicines, not medicine, these are astringents. Astringents are things that coagulate proteins and convert them into a hard cover. So we use them in bleeding gums and bleeding piles. A good example of astringent is the alum that males apply after shave. The alum is an astringent. It stops the bleeding by coagulating proteins near the wounds. Simply. So these can be used locally. Okay. Now this completes my first part of the first part, where we spoke about clotting factors and drugs that increase the clotting factors, vitamin K. Let us now move on to anticoagulants. These will be medicines that decrease the clotting factors, and here we are going to discuss heparin. Heparin has strong electronegative charges. It is the strongest organic acid present in the body. It's made by a lot of cells inside our body. It's made by cells present in our lungs, liver, intestinal mucosa. Mast cells make them, basophils make them. But the commercial ones that we get it from either ox lung or pig's intestine. Those are the good sources for commercial preparation. Now, how does this heparin work? It is suggested that heparin only speeds up reaction that breaks thrombin. Recall, thrombin converts fibrinogen to fibrin. If you destroy thrombin, then fibrinogen will not be converted into fibrin, so clots will not form. That's the logic behind giving this particular medicine. So this is how heparin works. There's an enzyme called as antithrombin. In my diagram above me, it's AT, antithrombin. The heparin has a unique 5 sugar sequence, a pentasaccharide sequence at one of the end. With the help of this pentasaccharide sequence, heparin attaches to antithrombin and activates it. Simple. So antithrombin 3 is activated, antithrombin is activated by this pentasaccharide sequence. Antithrombin is now ready to break thrombin and other clotting factors also. But heparin then extends its tail, the black line that you can see going around antithrombin and onto the thrombin is called as a scaffold. It's like bringing two people together, antithrombin and thrombin, and when they are together, antithrombin can break thrombin very easily. Now, not only thrombin, heparin also helps antithrombin break clotting factor 10, 2, 9, 11, 12 and 13. But at the dose in which we give, factor factor 10 mediated conversion of prothrombin to thrombin is affected the most. Heparin cannot stop clotting factor 7. Simple. So at low concentration, only factor 10A is stopped. So thrombin is not formed. Easy. But in good doses, in higher doses, it can inactivate 10 to clotting factor 10 to 9, 11, 12 and 13. Easy. Apart from that, there are additional properties of heparin, that it is an antiplatelet and it also can clear lipids from plasma samples, but they are not really in line with this particular topic. Remember, when I was explaining heparin, I just said pentasaccharide sequence binds to antithrombin gets activated. The other part of heparin is only a scaffold, right? It's only bringing things together, but activation is done by pentasaccharide sequence. So does the length of that scaffold matter? Not much. If you want to activate antithrombin, the scaffold is not important, only the pentasaccharide sequence is important. If that is true, can we only give pentasaccharide sequence and expect an anticoagulant action? Yes. The only pentasaccharide sequence is called as fondaparinux, and this is a pretty good drug. It also does the same thing, activates antithrombin so that these factors are broken. So a quick recap of all the things that I have said and some important stuff. First, heparin becomes anticoagulant of choice during pregnancy. It's ultra safe. It is kind of a natural substance in the body, so there will be no reactions. Even if it goes into the baby, no problem. Heparinized blood cannot be used for doing some blood counts because it changes the shape of RBCs and WBCs. It cannot be used for testing fragility of the RBCs, and it cannot be used for any complement fixation test. It messes with that test. So be careful when you're sending samples for lab investigation and you want blood counts. Note not to use heparinized blood. Side effects, we used to remember it as BOTHA, B-O-T-H-A. In our era, when we were medical students, there was this South African cricketer by the name Johan Botha. So for us it was very easy to remember, but you people can create your own. B for bleeding, duh, logical. O for osteoporosis, T for thrombocytopenia. Remember, heparin also interferes with platelets. Hypersensitivity reaction and transient reversible loss of hair or alopecia. So as I said, pentasaccharide sequence binds to antithrombin. At low doses, it will only inhibit factor 10A. At higher doses, it can inhibit many other clotting factors, including thrombin. The remaining part, pentasaccharide sequence plus the remaining part of heparin only is a scaffold. The scaffold is not important for breaking factor 10A. It is important for breaking all the other clotting factors, which means the scaffold is really not important. You can chop off these scaffold units, and as you chop them off, you get smaller and smaller fractions of heparin. We call them low molecular weight heparin. Remember, the pentasaccharide sequence still activates antithrombin. Simple. But why then keep that scaffold at all? Remove everything and only keep the pentasaccharide sequence. Yes, that can also be done. The action is good enough. We call this pentasaccharide sequence as fondaparinux. This is how simple heparin is. See, low molecular weight heparin, they will not interfere with other clotting factors. They will work only against factor 10, not against factor 2. Factor 2 is thrombin. So there are some advantages. One, because they are smaller pieces, they enter into bloodstream very easily. So even when you give a subcutaneous injections, you're not worried whether it will get stuck up in the local tissue or will enter into the blood or not. LMW, low molecular weight heparins, have a better bioavailability as compared to unfractionated heparin. and as a result they work for a longer period of time and they have a consistent T half. Consistent T half life is much more predictable, and as a result, because it's predictable, you know when to expect an action and when the action will stop for individual LMW heparins. Because you can predict what is going to happen, you don't require lab monitoring. That saves a lot of money for the patient. So where will you use LMW heparin? Wherever you are expecting clots, like deep vein thrombosis. So somebody has undergone a surgery, somebody had a major accident and is bedridden. You expect clots to happen in his legs, deep vein thrombosis. There you give prophylactic LMW heparin. And even if heparin is given after the clot is formed, it's still okay. New clot will not be formed. So it will really be helpful if you give it as prophylaxis also in the treatment of DVT. So by that logic, if somebody has a clot in his coronary artery, can we give it? Of course, yes. In case of unstable angina, myocardial infarction, give it. Even during they put shunts and cannulae, especially during dialysis. These shunts or cannulae, the needles that they put in, they might get clogged with blood clot. You don't want that happening because putting in a shunt is a lot of effort. So you want the shunts to remain clot free. LMW heparins will help us. Quite a lot of these LMW heparins are available. They go by different names: enoxaparin, reviparin, natroparin, dalteparin, parnaparin, ardeparin, and so on. So there are quite a lot of these things. There's hardly any difference between them. You can select any one depending on your choice. Well, can somebody overdose on heparin? They can. So what should we do? We have an antagonist for that. It's called as protamine sulfate. See, the reason why we are worried is the side effects. BOTHA, B for bleeding, that's the most important one, and T for thrombocytopenia. See, we are not worried about osteoporosis here. We are not worried about hair loss. No, we are more worried about bleeding because of either decreased clotting factors or decreased platelets. So we have to antagonize the action of heparin, and we have a medicine called as protamine. Remember, heparin was the strongest organic acid. This is highly basic. This product was obtained from the sperms of fish. And the idea is very simple. If a person has taken 100 units of heparin extra, you need to give 1 mg of protamine sulfate. That's the ratio in which we give it. See, the good news is heparin is kind of a natural product of our body. If it is the natural product of our body, there is mechanism already present which will help us destroy heparin. So you don't really have to give protamine sulfate, but sometimes you give real massive doses of heparin, like what happens in cardiovascular thoracic surgeries. In such cases, you might have to give heparin antagonist, protamine sulfate, to immediately stop the action of heparin. So there are selected conditions where heparin antagonist works. And it works only in LMW and unfractionated heparin. It works amazing in unfractionated, okay in LMW heparins, but it works zero in fondaparinux overdose. Okay, so this protamine sulfate requires that tail, that scaffold, to work properly. Simple, easy. So best in case of unfractionated heparin, good in LMW heparins, and not at all in fondaparinux. Simple. Another drug that you have to do is warfarin. Remember this particular flowchart that we spoke about? How reduced vitamin K is utilized by gamma glutamyl carboxylase to produce functional zymogens, but in that process the reduced vitamin K becomes oxidized vitamin K and becomes useless. Don't worry, we can reactivate oxidized vitamin K to reduced vitamin K by using vitamin K reductase. Now some people are clotting a lot, so we don't want them to produce so many clotting factors, and here is where warfarin comes in picture. Warfarin inhibits vitamin K reductase enzyme, and as a result, reduced vitamin K becomes oxidized vitamin K in the process of formation of functional zymogens, but that oxidized vitamin K cannot get reactivated. Slowly and gradually, the amount of reduced vitamin K in the body will start to decline, and oxidized vitamin K, useless vitamin K will increase, and at that time the production of functional zymogen will either decrease or stop. Simple. That's the entire plan. Now remember, the enzymes, the functional zymogens, not enzymes, the functional zymogens that are already formed, warfarin is not doing anything to them. It is stopping the production of new functional zymogens. Easy. New enzymes, new clotting factors are not formed. Easy to understand? I hope so. Which means when you give warfarin, you are not expecting immediate action, you are expecting a delayed action. Because new clotting factors will not be formed, no? But the old ones will still continue to work. Simple. We will have to wait for the old ones to get eliminated from the body before you can start seeing the action of warfarin, and that's where you need to know the T halves of clotting factor. Like what is the time in which their concentration becomes half in the blood. Another way of saying the same thing is, let us find out which clotting factor concentration will decrease first and which will end up last. Clotting factor 7 has a T half of 6 hours, which means within 6 hours the level of clotting factor 7 will start to decrease. Clotting factor 9 has a T half of 24 hours. 10 has a as a T half of 40 hours, whereas prothrombin, clotting factor 2, has a T half of 60 hours. 60 hours is around 2.5-3 days, which means for full blown effect of warfarin, it takes at least 3 days. At least 3 days. Till that time, the other clotting factors which were already synthesized are doing their job. Easy to understand this? Now, where will we give this? Why would we love to give a medicine that causes bleeding? No, we are not giving a medicine that causes bleeding. We are trying to give a medicine that decreases clotting, such as in case of DVT and pulmonary embolism. We want to decrease the clotting. So we give this particular medicine. Myocardial infarction, unstable angina. Heck, we can even give it in cases of rheumatic heart diseases and atrial flutter and atrial fibrillations. See, in atrial fibrillations, the heart is beating so fast that it's really not contracting and relaxing properly. As a result, in atrial fibrillation, chances of clots happening are extremely high. Hence, we can give it as a prophylaxis. In stroke, cerebrovascular accidents, we can give this particular medicine. Even after somebody has undergone vascular surgery, has a prosthetic heart valves, has retinal vein thrombosis, or has undergone hemodialysis, we can give warfarin directly. Okay, and there's a syndrome called as defibrillation syndrome, also known as DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation. In that condition also we can give it. Now you will be wondering, if fibrin is less, then why are we giving a medicine that decreases fibrin? The concept of DIC is beyond the scope of pharmacology, but let me tell you this so it makes sense. In defibrillation syndrome, clotting is the primary problem, excessive clotting. So there is too much of clotting happening in patient's body. When too much of clots are happening, clotting factors are used up, and because clotting factors are used up, their level is falling in the blood, and because the level is falling in the blood, this patient is at a higher risk for bleeding. I hope you get it. You stop the clotting factors will become normalized. That is what we are trying to do. Stop the clot. Don't allow body's ready-made clotting factor, already formed clotting factor, to be used up more. That's why in defibrillation syndrome we use this particular medicine. Simple enough. You must know the medicines that we have just described. Let's talk about part 2 of this video. The first part was about drugs that increase clotting factors, drugs that decrease clotting factors. Now I'm going to talk about a set of drugs that work on blood clot. The clot has already formed. I can do two things. One, break that clot, or give a medicine that does not break that clot. Simple. A clot breaking medicine will be called as thrombolytic. A medicine that does not allow a clot to break, it will be called as antifibrinolytic. Fibrinolytic include medicines such as streptokinase, urokinase, alteplase, retiplase, and so on. There's even tenecteplase. Antifibrinolytic include two medicines. One is called as epsilon aminocaproic acid, another is tranexamic acid. Let us have a look at their functioning. The chances of this coming in your exam is less, and hence I'll give you a shorter explanation for this. This is how things work. A clot is basically an insoluble fibrin knot with trapped blood cells in it. To break the clot, you need to convert insoluble fibrin into fibrin fragments, also known as FDPs, fibrin degradation products. So you have to break this. This is what naturally happens in the body. There's a substance called as plasmin which can do this job of breaking fibrinogen into fibrin. Now who activates plasmin? Plasmin actually is present in the form of plasminogen. It is present in our body also, but it has to be activated to plasmin before it can start the process of breaking the blood clot. So we have something called as TPA, tissue plasminogen activator. So tissue plasminogen activator will convert plasminogen into plasmin. This plasmin will break the fibrin clot, insoluble fibrin clot, into fragments, fibrin fragments or fibrin degradation product, and that's how things would be. Easy. If we give streptokinase, urokinase, alteplase, tenecteplase, retiplase, so on, these medicines will enhance the conversion of plasminogen to plasmin, which means clots formed in the body will break. And if you give medicines such as epsilon aminocaproic acid or tranexamic acid, the plasminogen will not get converted into plasmin, the clots will stay. Easy. Let me help you out with the uses of fibrinolytics, because that is something they can ask you. You want to open up the blood clot in case of myocardial infarction? Of course, yes, give it. You want to remove that clot from the leg veins in case of DVT? Give fibrinolytics. You want to remove the clots present in someone's lungs who is suffering from pulmonary embolism? Give fibrinolytics. If somebody's arteries have been blocked because of some reason by a blood clot, give fibrinolytics. And even in stroke, you can give fibrinolytics. Simple, easy to remember. Just have a look at streptokinase from the textbook, and just to be on the safer side, read epsilon aminocaproic acid. Chances of that coming in the exam is extremely less, but just for the sake of doing it, do it. Easy? I hope so. So the first part of my video was everything based on clotting factors. This small second segment was everything based on the clot. Do you want to keep the clot or break the clot? But let's not forget an important component and the third part of my video, platelets. There are two steps in which platelets play a very important role. Step number one is called as primary hemostasis. This is how a platelet looks. This is a very diagrammatic representation, but I hope you get the point. A platelet has lots of tubular structure, lot of glycogen, lot of granules, lot of mitochondria, and in these granules, here written as alpha granules and dense granule, they have special chemical mediators which help the platelet cause a change in their shape and cause clot formation. So let's talk about primary hemostasis. Whenever a platelet comes in contact with a damaged endothelium, see, when the endothelium is damaged, the subendothelial, below the endothelium, collagen is exposed. Simple. Endothelium is gone, you can see what is below the endothelium, which is subendothelial collagen. Platelet can adhere to this collagen in the subendothelium. But to adhere, to hold on to, you require a protein, a glycoprotein. In case of platelet, this glycoprotein is called as GP182A. GP for glycoprotein. So GP182A helps in binding of platelet to subendothelial collagen. Simple. Is this binding absolute strong? No, this binding is not strong. This has to be stabilized, and here a factor called as von Willebrand's factor, VWF, that's how you write it in short. Von Willebrand's factor attaches to another protein on the surface of platelets, that is GP1B9, and this combination becomes stable. So what I am trying to tell you is, in a normal scenario, platelets cannot stick anywhere because there is nice endothelium. If the endothelium is damaged because of injury, the platelet then can see the subendothelial collagen. GP182A binds to collagen. Okay, this binding is not fixed, and hence GP1B9 of platelet binds to von Willebrand's factor. Now, von Willebrand's factor is present near the site of injury. It is made by the injured endothelial cells. Okay, so platelet has now stuck to collagen with GP182A and stuck to von Willebrand's factor with GP1B9. Now the platelet starts changing its shape, and as it changes its shape, it releases from within the granules. Dense granule, alpha granules, lysosomal vesicles, all these granules release their chemical mediators which cause other platelets to approach the platelet which has stuck. It's like one platelet has stuck and it is calling other platelet. The other platelet comes and then it also shakes hand with the first platelet. So first and second are binding with the help of GP2B3A. Second and third are binding with GP2B3A. Like this, a lot of cross-linking of platelet takes place and a primary plug is formed, a primary hemostatic plug is formed. This primary platelet plug is weak. It will work in association with the clotting factors that we have already described, the fibrin, and form a stronger secondary hemostasis where platelets play the role of squeezing that clot, literally dehydrating it and making it stronger. Simple. Now at this point of time, I just want you to understand that all these GPs that we have been talking about and all these chemical mediators we have been talking about are the most important thing for platelets to do their job. If the glycoproteins are not there, if they can't work, platelets can't work. If the granules are not released, if the chemical mediators are not released, the platelets will not be able to form a clot. Let's talk about drugs that act on this platelet and stop this process that I have diagrammatically represented here and I have already explained a few minutes back. Simple. You can pause the video, see this, and if you have any doubts, you can definitely comment in the comment section below. I will be happy to help you out. So what are these antiplatelet drugs? These are the drugs that are on your screen right now: aspirin, dipyridamole, P2Y12 receptor blockers like ticlopidin, clopidogrel, prasugrel, and GP2B3A antagonists such as apixaban, eptifibatide, and tirofiban. Luckily for you, we need to do aspirin a little bit in detail. Let's talk about aspirin. In another chapter, we are going to go even more in detail. We are going to talk about aspirin as a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. But in this chapter, this is what you need to know as far as aspirin is concerned. First, aspirin inhibits an enzyme called as cyclooxygenase and TX synthase or thromboxane synthase. aspirin acetylates and inhibits these enzymes, and as a result prostaglandins and thromboxane is not formed, especially thromboxane A2. It's suppressed at very low doses. Okay. When aspirin acts on platelets, the platelets become completely non-functional, and as a result the bleeding time gets prolonged for around 5 to 7 days. 7 days is the lifespan of a platelet, so that is how much aspirin works brilliantly. A 40 mg per day is enough dose to have an effect on platelet aggregation. So if you want best inhibition, the minimum is 40 mg per day. The best inhibition will happen somewhere between 75 to 150 mg aspirin per day. Given this much, it's more than sufficient dose. At low doses, 75 to 150 mg per day or 300 mg 2 times a week, thromboxane A2 formation is selectively suppressed. If you increase the dose to more than 900 mg per day, it decreases both prostaglandin and prostacyclin, thromboxane A2 and prostacyclin synthesis, TXA2 and PGI2 production, which we don't want. So we don't really give that high doses. Give it in low doses only. So where will we use it? Coronary artery disease and all acute coronary syndromes where we are expecting blood clots to happen, or cerebrovascular diseases where we are expecting a clot to happen in the brain, prosthetic heart valves, arteriovenous shunts, thromboembolism, deep vein thrombosis, peripheral vascular disease. See, any condition where you are expecting platelets to form a clot, you give this medicines. Simple. So this concludes our most important video from blood pharmacology. We were talking about medicines that work on the clotting mechanism. I hope you have understood this. If yes, give this video a thumbs up, and if you have a doubt, either comment in the comment section below, or if you are my student, you of course have my WhatsApp number. Please coordinate with me, let me know which part of this particular video you did not understand, and I will be more than happy to help you. Till the next time we meet, this is Dr. Avinash signing off for now. Take care, keep studying and keep rocking. Bye bye.